There we go. I just wanted to say today we're going to have an AI seminar on Paleogeosciences with Deborah Khider, who's here at USC-ISI. In this talk, so first, Deborah is a data scientist at ISI, as I mentioned. Her research is in paleoclimate and informatics. She got a PhD in ocean sciences at USC. And then she's held multiple postdoc positions at UT Austin, UCSB, and USC. And her work is on paleoclimate time series analysis and uncertainty. And she is currently involved in several projects on metadata for paleoclimate science data and modeling, as well as automating workflows in the domain. So with that, let me send it, give the mic to Deborah effectively.
Thanks for the introduction and thank you for coming. So what I thought I was going to do today is actually talk a little bit about artificial intelligence in the paleogeosciences, what has been done so far, what are the remaining challenges, and therefore the opportunities that we have to contribute. So first, let me actually go over the definition of what paleogeosciences are. So it contains the word paleo, which means we're looking at a past perspective on Earth's history. And geosciences means essentially any geoscience field that you can think of has a paleo perspective, a past perspective. So climate, lake, hydrology, and so on. So for this talk, I'm really going to focus on paleoclimate and paleoceanography, but a lot of the discussion can actually apply to the other fields. So why study paleoclimatology? And I think this is actually the title of a paper by Bruce Doe back in 1980, and it summarizes very well why we do this as a community. And it's really the fact that the past is the key to the future. So if we understand the past, it allows us to face our future better. So the questions that we try to answer with paleoclimatology are things like how climate has changed in the past, how much, how often, how fast, and why. So the figure on the right is probably the most famous figure in paleoclimatology. It was created by Michael Mann back in 1999, and it was showing Northern Hemisphere cooling for most of the past 1,000 years, followed by an uptick in temperature that corresponds to anthropogenic activities. And
if
so this,
interrupt just very briefly, it looks like I see a little square that's sort of blocking your figure. It says build order.
I see it too.
Yeah, so I'm afraid I can't see the date or I can't see the temperatures after 1800.
I'm not sure why.
I think
Deborah, it says no build effects.
Yeah, maybe you should unshare the screen and reshare the screen.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe that'll unshare the screen as in unshare the screen from yeah, and then reshare it, and maybe that'll sort of, I think, in other words, you have something in the desktop which
someone suggested exiting full window and closing it.
Yeah,
I just did that.
Also, if you look through your Windows list, if you see that window as being present, then you might just click on it to bring it up, then you can close it.
Yeah.
All right, hold on. So what I can do is first this. No, I can't. So essentially this graph has been called a hockey stick because of that change, the abrupt change after 1850. So the second reason to study paleoclimatology is essentially being able to provide test data sets for the verification of climate models. So this is a figure from the last report from the comparison panel on climate change. And what this is actually looking at is model data in the shades, and then the little circles correspond to the data itself. And so it's a very simple idea that to do the comparison with climate model is to compare the color in the dot with the value in the model. And that gives an idea of how well the models are performing. So something to remember about paleoclimatology in general is that we do not measure the climate quantities directly. We have no way of actually measuring temperature directly, so we use something called a proxy. So what is a proxy exactly? It's the idea of basically scientists going out in the field and collecting an archive of some kind. So in this case, we're talking about a marine sediment. Being able to make measurements on that archive. And the way this works, and this is called the observation, and the way this works is you have the observation actually reflect changes in the environment. And in this case, we're talking about the surface ocean environment, and it's done through what we call a sensor, which senses the environment and encodes the information into the archive that we can actually measure. So this is one example of what we call a proxy system, which includes the archive, the observation, and the sensor. But we have multitudes of proxy systems. So I just give you this example. This is another example of a proxy system looking at making measurements, isotope measurements on wood, and the sensor in this case is the tree. The sensor does not have to be a biological entity. This is one other example of a proxy system where we go and take out speleotherms, so cave deposits, make the same actually type of measurements of isotopes. But really the sensor here, what allows us to make inference about the atmosphere is what's happening in the soil in the karst above the cave. So something that's becoming more and more obvious, I hope, is actually the amount of expertise and the broad expertise that's needed to actually interpret those records. So if I go one by one, in the case of my marine sediment, I need to know something about oceanography. I need to have some notion of chemistry to make those measurements. I need to understand sedimentology to understand the archive. I need some information about ecology to understand where this guy lives and actually what it records, and biology to understand how it's recording my chemical information. If you're working on trees, same idea, you still need information about chemistry, ecology, biology, but in this case, you actually need to know something about atmospheric dynamics, and you need to know something about soil processes to understand how the tree is getting its water. If you're working on this system, you need to understand atmospheric dynamics, chemistry, soil processes. And this is just an example of 3 proxy systems. We really have a lot more than that. So essentially, something to keep in mind is the people involved in the community have broad expertise, and that leads to extremely diverse data. And as a consequence, most of the data that we collect are actually provided by one individual investigator or one lab group. It's not exactly like a big group working on the same thing and having maybe like 3 or 4 groups within the United States. It's really like almost one PI, one lab group. The second thing to remember about those records is that they offer a picture of the climate at one location through time. So once you get your archive, what happens is you make your measurements down the archive. And so it gives you a time series through time. So each of these dots represent one of these lines over the past 2,000 years in this case. So if we want to be able to make inference about global climate, we need to actually have a multitude of these. And essentially this has been done in the past, like Michael Mann was one of the first ones to do it. But now there's an acceleration of basically making databases that would summarize essentially information for different archive for different timescales. So this is an example of a paper published in 2017 looking at, again, the past 2,000 years and that hockey stick curve of cooling followed by abrupt warming. So it's really an update from the manual reconstruction with a lot more records over the past 2,000 years. This is actually a paper that we published back in April this year. Instead of the past 2,000 years, now we're looking at the past 12,000 years. This is how network of proxies And this is essentially the temperature reconstruction for different latitudes and land versus ocean. But what I really want to highlight here is the number of people it takes to actually create that database. And that reflects essentially that diversity in the records that we face, diversity of expertise, but also diversity of data. So the question that I actually asked myself when I was asked to give this talk is whether or not paleoclimate fulfilled its promises. Is it really informing, giving us information about the past so that we can make informed decisions about our future? And my answer to this is mostly yes, it has, and especially in the 10 to 20 years, past 10, 20 years. And the reason for this, or at least I'm going to argue that the advancement in informatics and especially in geoinformatics have made this possible. So I know I'm going to take a lot of heat from the paleoclimate community, but I think without informatics, we wouldn't have been able to make the leaps that we're doing now. So if you tell people that they're going to have to work with computers, most of what they're going to be thinking about is exactly this picture, which is the idea where you have a group of people coming together, being able to ask questions to a computer and getting their answer very easily. So we're not that far away from the reality. Essentially, if you're working on this kind of project, you have somebody in charge, in this case, the captain, who needs to make decisions based on timely science results. And then you have somebody in science who actually need to find data that's pertinent to the problem, run the analysis, and interpret the results so that he can communicate to its captain. And finally, you have somebody in communication that actually needs to communicate the decision to the stakeholders. And when you're talking about climate, the stakeholders becomes essentially the entire world. And if you're in Star Trek, or if you're hopefully in a very, very near future, what you're hoping for is that the computer will be doing all the work. And all you have to do is essentially that communication between people. So how does this work in practice? You could have somebody in charge essentially saying, I need to understand changes in ocean temperatures. And how that translates is in the science officer asking the pertinent question to the computer. And that could look something like this. Computers search for records that represent sea surface temperature over the past 10,000 years and run spectral analysis. So we're not in Star Trek, we're not in the 23rd century, but we do have workflows. And essentially, if I put that query to the computer into a simple workflow, it would look something like this. Query the data catalog and download the data set, run the spectral analysis, and visualize and interpret the results. So doing this as a scientist and by hand, I have an idea of how I need to do this. Now, for a computer to do this, two things need to happen. First, we need to standardize the data. That's the key really to enable the automation. And the second part is to create analysis code that makes use of that standard. And so essentially, this is what we did with the Linkers project, which brought together climate scientists from USC Earth Sciences and NAU with computer scientists, mostly from ISI and NAU. And what we were trying to do is essentially standardize those paleoclimate data. So the first question that we need to ask, that we actually asked ourselves and toyed around for about 6 months is, what is the standard? We had to start there. And we looked at the definition from the NSF EarthCube, which basically said that a standard is a public specification documenting some practice or technology that is adopted and used by a community. And it's very vague, but there is 2 pieces of information here. The first one is that emphasis on community. If one person creates a way of doing something, it's not a standard. But that idea of practice and technology, even if the community comes together and have a document, a public document, if it's not being used, it's not exactly a standard either. So going back to looking at the climate, the modeling community, they've been really successful in terms of sharing their data with other fields and actually being able to create code and automate a lot of things. And the reason really is in one sentence, is every time we work with them, the first thing they ask us is, why don't you use NetCDF? And actually what they mean is, why don't you use NetCDF-CF? So you're gonna ask me, what is NetCDF-CF? So essentially the idea is that the data is stored in a NetCDF file, and the file itself stores the data, so either temperature or precipitation. It's gridded data through latitude and longitude, with time. So it's a format, but it's a self-describing format. It has metadata in it that has to be structured in a certain way. And this is where the CF comes from, which stands for climate and forecast. Metadata convention, which tells people how they should name their variables, and what metadata needs to be in the file so that everyone can interpret the data. So that gave us a really good foundation for us to actually try to get a standard. And so NetCDF is not appropriate for our data because our data is actually not gridded. It's one-time series, but also it's very rich. It's a lot more metadata rich than you would expect from climate models. So unfortunately, NetCDF wasn't really an option. But following that idea, we realized we needed 3 ingredients, essentially. A standard representation of the data, so something to replace the NetCDF format. A standard terminology for the data, so the part of the CF convention that talks about naming variables. And finally, standard guidelines for reporting the data. And this is what the community has been really doing for the past 5, 6, 7 years, is trying to get to that standard in different ways. So on our side, what we created is something called the linked paleo data format, which gave birth to the linked Earth ontology to represent the data. We worked with the NOAA, National Ocean Atmospheric Administration, on the past thesaurus, which is the way of having a standard terminology on how we call those variables. And the last part of work that we did is actually kind of create a community standard for reporting our data. So I'm just going to go over Lipid and PAX. So Lipid, again, is called the linked paleo data format. And what it is essentially a zip file. And if you unzip it, you get the data itself in CSV format. And each column corresponds to a variable. And the metadata is stored in JSON LD. There is a relationship between the column number and what the variable actually is. So in this case, the variable being representation of time with units and so on. So this essentially allowed us to really conceptualize what the data set should look like. And then we worked with Yolanda, Danielle, and Varun on going from that format, from that JSON file into a formal ontology. And we expanded to include information about the proxy system that we actually use to make our inference about climate, how we actually make those measurements, and information about what we inferred about the climate. So this ontology reuses widely used models such as the Dublin Core Terms, GeoSparkle, friend of a friend. But really, this is what unlocked a lot of capabilities for us. And one of them was the creation of the Linked Earth platform, which is based on semantic media wiki technology, which allows us to actually store our data sets, both the data and the metadata. There is an interface for scientists to be able to edit the metadata, and they get credits. One of the things that the ISI team worked on is essentially extending those capabilities to allow for community discussion. Again, the goal was trying to create that standard for the community. So extending for discussion, as well as creating polls so that we can make decisions. And essentially, this platform was used very extensively in our reporting standard. And so what we did is we had a workshop back in 2016 where we invited about 30 people from the community and decided on how to proceed on how to make that reporting standard. So 2 things were decided back then. The first is that the data is so diverse that we actually had to create working groups that corresponded to the different, at least archive, if not proxy system. And the second is that we should have 2 different standards, one for new data sets that are being contributed from now on, and data sets that are legacy data sets on other databases. So the working groups essentially formed starting in September of 2016, and for about a year, they actually came together either completely virtual, sometimes at conferences, and essentially kind of tried to describe which properties were needed in the files. And finally, in September of 2017, we launched a survey to actually gather the votes from the community. So in the end, we had 135 researchers from all over the globe who voted on 603 properties and decided whether or not those properties should be essential, recommended, or desired. So this is a mind map of what the property looked like. I understand you can't read it, but essentially it gives you an idea of how extensive this was and how some archives are more represented than others. So essential properties were properties that without which we cannot live, like the record is completely useless. Recommended means it would be nice to have, especially to do further analysis, and desired are things that, well, even if we don't have it, it's not going to end our science. And so the survey went out, and these are the results. So again, we have recommendation for new data sets and for legacy data set, but for both of them, what you can see in a cross archive is that a lot of people were voting for those things to be essential. So there is a desire for from the community to actually describe their data sets with as much details as they can so that we can actually advance our field. So now we are at a point where we actually need to implement PACS into Lipid, but there are several barriers to this. The first one is how much metadata archiving we need. So if you do this by hand, it actually takes hours. So is there a way for us to lower that barrier? And I'll talk a little bit about this in this talk. But we also need to change the incentive structure. And it goes from funding agencies, obviously in terms of actually getting funding to do this, but also in terms of maybe recommending a standard for a community when a proposal gets funded. Editors and publishers have pretty much the same responsibility. If a study is being published, they should also try to provide community guidelines when people contribute their data. And I would say we published the standard into the Paleoceanography and Paleoclimatology journal. We had tremendous support from the editor. They actually invited us to make a contribution based on this into their centennial grant challenges. And we had several discussions following this with them on how we can actually implement PACS and how they can actually help us recommend it to researchers. There is also responsibility from professional societies. So the Paleoceanography and Paleoclimatology depends from the American Geophysical Union, which is pretty much the largest gathering of geoscientists. And we also got a lot of help, feedback, and support from the PAGES organization. And PAGES are the one organizing those working groups that do the data gathering for like the two studies that I showed you, the 2,000 and 12,000 years. But most importantly, and I think this falls more onto scientists, is to create code that allows you to work with that data. And I'm going to go back to talking about NetCDF a little bit and what made NetCDF so useful and actually so prevalent in the community is because people started creating codes that allowed scientists to just manipulate their data with one line of code. And one of the most successful projects is called X-Array. And essentially what you can do is once you create your variable object with one single command very easily, you can make this type of plot where the code knows where to grab the relevant variables and the relevant naming. So for us, this was something that we really wanted to emulate in terms of creating code to make Lipid useful. So what does it look like? So essentially, we have various libraries to work with those Lipid files, things that are very simple just to open, manipulate, and close the files in the programming languages that are mostly used by the community. And we also created code that allows you to do science with those files. And here I'm going to really talk about the Python implementation because that's the one I've been involved the most with. So the code is called paleoclim, and essentially it's a Python package for the analysis and visualization of paleoclimate data. So again, really our goal was to emulate the success of the climate community. So what happens with this package is you can create a series object, so a time series object, and then with one command, you can actually tell it to plot, and it will try to get the appropriate metadata that's stored in a Lipid file to actually get the value and time. And it contains a lot of data transformation within the code so that a scientist doesn't have to waste their time on the data transformation. So besides plotting, it does things like mapping, but mostly all of what we do falls under time series analysis. So again, it has function for spectral analysis. working the same way. Once you have your time series object, you can just run one command to actually get your spectral analysis. And we have various methods that are actually described in a minute. Other things we're doing are wavelet analysis, causality analysis, and most importantly, we have a lot of the pre-processing code for this. So paleoclim right now is available on the development branch of our GitHub repo, and it's also available in a container on Docker Hub. So what does it look like when you put this together in terms of the workflow that we were talking about at first? So we're almost there, we're actually there. In terms of being able to query our data catalog, the Linkers platform, there is a Spectral endpoint that allows us to really efficiently query what we need and download our datasets automatically. For analysis, something as simple as mapping, again, paleoclim can take those files in the Lipid format and make simple plots like this that tells you where the data comes from. For spectral analysis, again, paleoclim can handle the pre-processing as well as the analysis step very easily, and also can handle visualizing the results. So we are there in terms of having codes that does this more or less automatically. It's just a question of putting everything together. But I'd like to go back to spectral analysis for a minute, and the realization that when we talk about spectral analysis, it's not just about this function, it's knowing how to pre-process the data. And most paleoclimatologists will understand how to interpret and visualize their results, but they might lack the knowledge to actually choose the correct analysis method depending on the data and the pre-processing steps. So we wanted to go one step further and actually automate this entire pipeline. And this is work I've been doing with Yolanda and Varun at ISI, 2 students from computer science and 1 student from earth sciences, where we've been trying to automate time series analysis. So in a nutshell, the strategy is to actually create templates that we get from the literature, from what people actually do when they run those analysis methods. And so this is an example for the spectral analysis workflow. So it looks like we have to standardize the series, detrend it, remove the outliers, hypothesize over the missing values, run that spectral analysis, do some significance testing, and visualize our results. And that's basically the strategy. And then what we can do is have a model catalog, and in this case, it becomes the functions that we have in paleoclim to instantiate every single of these steps. But one of the things that we need to keep in mind is those steps depend on what the data look like. So if I have to detrend data that has a nonlinear trend, I don't want to be using linear detrending. So somehow my automated system needs to know that I have a nonlinear trend and apply the proper method. So how do we do this? Essentially, we use the WINGS workflow system. WINGS stands for Workflow Instantiation and Generation System. And it was the perfect system to use for what we wanted to do, because we can actually, in WINGS, have abstract workflow template that describe those expert strategies that I just shown you on the previous slide. So that idea of if you want to run spectral analysis, you have those pre-processing steps that you have to do. And so each of those abstract components are actually captured within WINGS and can be instantiated with any of the methods on the right-hand side. So a few things that, another thing that WINGS was useful for is to be able to capture the properties, metadata properties that reflects the data characteristic. So things like, is the series evenly spaced? Is there a trend in my data? But one of the things to remember is that any pre-processing step can actually change that metadata. So it's not just enough to describe the original data set. We have to describe the data set automatically after each pre-processing step. So that has to be extended to do this. The next extension we had to do is to actually allow WINGS to skip steps. So not every pre-processing step is needed. For example, if I don't have a trend, then I don't have to detrend. Or if one method doesn't require one of these steps, then I need to actually skip over it. So an example of this in spectral analysis is that we have 5 methods. And the Lomsky-Argol methods and the weighted wavelet Z transform does not require for the data to not have missing value in time. It can actually handle it. So that makes this step useless when using either this method or this method. So we had to implement rules in Wings that actually let the system knows when it requires evenly spaced data and when it doesn't require evenly spaced data. And the output of this is to essentially be able to skip a step when needed. So in the executable workflow, if the step is needed, it's being executed. If the step is not needed, then it's not being executed. As far as I am concerned as a paleoclimatologist, all I have to do is essentially give my data to the system, let it do its job, and get my output plot, which is essentially what we wanted to do and provide to the community. In terms of future work on this, we have to work on other strategies. We already have worked on the wavelet strategy, and now we're moving on the cross-wavelet correlation and causality, which is what we use the most in Paleo. We need to work a little bit more on the data profiling. What type of trend do we see, and what are the best methods to remove them? And the accuracy of those analysis methods, considering the noise that we have in the data, if you remember the first few figures that I showed you, and how many missing values can we actually be missing. But if I go back to my 23rd century analogy, 24th century analogy, in terms of Spock being able to ask that question, I think we're there in terms of having a computer automatically return essentially the plot that allows him to interpret the data and communicate to his captain. But really what the captain needs to do is make decisions based on timely science results. And the main bottleneck in this pipeline is not actually the analysis and visualization. We've actually taken care of this. It's the army of people that you need to actually be able to enter all of the metadata into the data catalog to make it queryable. So the question is, can we leverage machine learning to help with metadata annotation? That's something that I hope I can actually do very soon, and would love collaboration on this. But this is the challenge. This is what the data looks like on public repositories. So it's fairly unstructured metadata, and then the data are in different tabs. But what I really need to lift from this are things like the site name, and then the geographical location. This is altitude, and the understanding that this is actually sediments, so it's negative altitude. I need to get information from that description. So I need to basically go from that unstructured description to something a lot more structured. On the data side, none of the data looks the same. This is just one example. But basically understanding that blank are actually missing values. Understanding that these are the units. Understanding that this is actually very relevant information that I need to store separately from that value. So there is hope in the sense that that database since 2012 has been trying to standardize things a little bit, or structure, I should say, things a little bit. So these are the newer files, which might make it a little bit easier to lift information from. Again, if that's something that you're very interested in reading those table, please get in touch with me. I would love to collaborate on this. But again, things to remember is really lifting these are easy, but lifting that kind of information, those are the units, when it's actually not said, is more complicated. And also making sure that we're not lifting useless information. In this case, I really need all of that information, but I have no idea how even to use this. So not only do we need to do things timely, so help scientists to annotate their data, but again, we need to make decisions, right? And we don't make decisions about the past, we make decisions about our future. And that gets into the field of weather forecasting. So today, the way it's done mostly is we use theory-based models to predict the state of the atmosphere, so temperature, precipitation, mostly in advance. And how long in advance do we do this? Anywhere from 15 days to a year. So why do we need those forecasts? And essentially, it goes back to decision-making. So this is the decision timescale that we're looking at. Anything from like within a week, which are kind of like emergency response decisions that you have to make immediately, to seasonal timescale, things where you try to manage what's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 months. So if you're looking at the agriculture system, things like when should you plant your crops and when should you irrigate and apply nutrients, all the way to climate timescale. And this has more to do with infrastructure planning. But essentially, having forecasts on those multitude timescales are very important for pretty much every single human system that you can think of, from agriculture to water resources to energy and crisis management. And what's actually really shown in cartoonish way on this graph is the uncertainty in the forecast. And as we move further in the future, we have more and more uncertainty, to the point that really we're talking about outlooks here. We're not talking about really precise measurements. So the question really is, how do we do this? And in physical models, this is what we use today. Essentially, the idea is to use physical equations in each grid cell to describe the laws of physics and essentially get temperature and precipitation information out of it. And that can be very computationally expensive. And the idea that's been going around is whether or not machine learning can actually do this as good as or even better than physical models for a fraction of the computational cost. So most of the work has focused on the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is that idea that during an El Nino year, you have warmer than usual temperature in the tropical Pacific. And it goes into that index calculation. And essentially, if you're 1 sigma above mean condition in the tropical Pacific, it's an El Nino. If you're 1 sigma below, it's called a La Nina, which is that reverse condition where the warm water is being pushed back in the west side. So why do we care about ENSO? And that's because it's the leading mode of variability on Earth. So knowing something about how the tropical ocean is reacting tells us something about wet and dry conditions on land. So this is during the La Nina phase. And if you live in California, you know that we get rain during an El Nino and drier condition during a La Nina, but it's not just us, it's pretty much all over the globe. So what's been done recently is to use ML to predict ENSO using deep learning for the most part. Those 3 papers came out within 3 months of each other. What they have in common, and I'm really going to be talking and focusing about this one, is the idea of using convolutional neural network that takes the spatial data and return an index for that region of the tropical Pacific where we can infer ENSO. And what they found so far is that the CNN can do better than actually the models that we have today, the physical models that we have. And so that got me thinking a little bit about like the opportunity in working in this. And essentially in this paper, the argument that they were making, the reason they could do this is because they used long simulation of climate as training. And they argued that really the fact that they could expand the training to 400 years is what really helped them. So I tried to reproduce their study and actually change the number of years in training, looking at how many months in advance we're doing the forecast. And my skill was the correlation with instrumental data. And I'm not really sure that having more data is really helping a lot. It is helping some, but not. And so the question really is, can we have better data and better models? So the outstanding question in this, something that I'm, again, looking for collaboration with, is whether or not we can change their idea a little bit more. So instead of predicting on temperature, can we actually predict on ENSO? So again, this is that idea of 1 sigma deviation from the mean. So we go from a regression problem to a classification problem. The second is, do we need a physical layer? ENSO has some physical components to it that we understand. Should we add it and go into theory-guided machine learning? But most importantly, should we really be using model data for training? Or should we actually take advantage of our paleoclimate past so that we can use it in trainees across various boundary conditions? So now we're not limited to whatever the models we're doing. We can actually look at things that happen during ice ages, for example. And to me, machine learning is really what's going to be the key to unlock the full potential of paleoclimate data. So again, I started this by saying the past is the key to the future. And essentially, machine learning provides this. It's a machine that can learn about the past and allows us to predict our future. So the last part of the scientific study is to actually be able to communicate the decision to stakeholders. And usually the way scientists have been doing this lately is through Twitter, by tweeting their research finding, by tweeting their opinions and so on. And this is a project that we've been working on. Actually, the students have led, and Fred and I have co-advised to look at the counter narratives of climate change. So what do we mean by this? So scientists post their findings on social media, mostly Twitter. And when you post your findings, this is the kind of answer that you get. You're not a climate scientist, you're a political propagandist pushing fraudulent, incomplete, deceptive data to bolster a false narrative. You've been exposed multiple times and you're only supposed to follow globalist criminals. Joseph Goebbels would be very proud of you. Another tweet that was sent back. Maybe you should try a different tactic. Your act is boring and unappealing. Climate cash is quickly drying up as a real scientific crisis will challenge all of our available resources. Put your PhD in chemistry to work to do something useful. You're a loser, Courtney, on the losing side of the debate. So this is the kind of responses that you get. I've gotten some of them. Some people get it more than others. But the question that the students really want to answer, and again, I'm presenting their work here, is whether or not there was a gender bias in those hate tweets that were being sent. So what they did is essentially collect tweets and replies to tweets from a list of climate scientists that was compiled by Catherine Hayhoe, has about 3,000 members, and it's about a 50-50% ratio. So they collected the tweets since February. And in addition, they added tweets that had the following hashtags. So one thing to remember is we're human, even though we work on climate. So the year being 2020, we don't just tweet about climate, we also tweet about COVID-19, protest, wearing a mask, politics. So the first thing that they did is actually apply topic modeling so that we could filter out the tweets that had to do with climate. So this is just a word cloud showing the results of those tweets. So even though climate is the most prevalent, the reason the pandemic is also showing in those tweets is because our response to the coronavirus crisis is actually very informative to the response that we need to have for climate change. So there is a correlation there. And so what was done is to divide those tweets, the replies to the tweets by gender. So it was classified with men, women, non-binary, and others. And so there is a lot more replies going toward male scientists than women scientists or non-binaries. And then as a first preliminary cleaning, looking at profanity check in those replies. And something that was kind of interesting is it's 2% across the board. No matter if you're men, women, non-binary, 2% of your tweet are going to contain, of replies to your tweet are going to contain some profanity. So obviously a lot more work to be done to look at really the gender bias in there, but giving you an idea of when you're trying to actually communicate your results to the community, to the people who actually, first of all, are going to be impacted by it and should actually do something about it. It's not that easy. So hopefully I actually went quickly over everything that can be done in paleoclimate and hopefully convince you that really what we want is this. We want the computer to be doing all the work and being able to have those communication. And I think we're further along than we were 10 years ago. And I think there is a bright future in trying to actually have those fields converge and helping scientists do their work. And I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Deborah. So let me see if people have questions. I have some questions, but I just want to see if anyone wants to raise their hand using the little raise your hand sign. All right, well, I guess I have two questions. The first is, so you checked on your tweets the profanity. Have you checked sentiment? Like you might see that people may give more negative sentiment to women than to men, even if they're equally polite in their language.
Yeah, so we've tried a few things on this, to be honest with you, and none of the classifier that we've used so far has really been, we're going to say useful, in the sense that some things were classified one way but really weren't that way, or the sentiment wasn't there but the words was there. So we're trying to figure out, and by we, the students are trying to figure out a better way to classify and do sentiment analysis. And I'm sure they would love any pointers.
Actually, out of curiosity, do you use Fader? That seems to be what many people use.
You know, if, because I was pretty much the climate scientist consultant on this. So Fred is the one really looking at the algorithm and so on. So I'll let him answer that if he's on the call.
Yeah, I'm here. So yeah, we used Vader at first, but it's kind of shallow. So we're looking into some of the more nuanced aggressive language classifiers, like the Davidson one from a couple of years ago. That seems to be giving us a little bit better performance than just throwing it into Vader, which is mostly keyword matching.
I see. I mean, but the fact that you don't see, I mean, even if you have errors, do you think it's just that the errors are high, or do you think that there's relative gender parity in this case?
So I think the errors are pretty high right now. I think we need to bring that down a little bit before we can say anything conclusive.
I see. The other question I had, Deborah, related to your issue you had about freeform metadata,
Yes.
freeform text as metadata. What I was actually really curious about, for those of you who might know, certainly anyone who works in NLP is aware of this new what is it called? GPT-3, where there's these, OpenAI did this incredible analysis to create sort of a transformer, a way of basically a machine that could basically understand a lot of text, just to put it in a simple way. And what I've seen it used for is an enormous number of things, including people who give free-form requests for code. Like you put into GPT-3, like, I want this HTML to have 3 circles with draft written on it, and it will actually give you the code for the HTML text that will look like that. Or maybe it's CSS text. But the point was that I almost wonder if something like GPT-3 could be useful to actually extract this useful free text metadata.
You know, I'm willing to try anything at this point. I've tried a few things, and most of the problem that I run into is really that idea of like knowledge, like the chemistry knowledge that's needed and the physics knowledge, and sometimes it's actually not in those systems.
Yeah, I mean, then although I don't know much about it, I can at least point you in the right direction afterwards.
I would love that, yes.
These are generally kind of unbound models that are perfectly happy to hallucinate stuff that doesn't exist either. So if you're using it to, I wouldn't use it as a data cleaner. You're not going to be guaranteed to get back a subset of what you put in.
But do you think it'll be able to extract data rather than?
So by extract data, you mean return a subset of what you put in, right?
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
No, I would never trust a language model to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, so the idea is not necessarily to have it like 100%, but at least if we could have like 80% and have a human look at it, but at least 80% of the way would actually help.
Right, but so would you be happy if it added 20% of seemingly good content that is actually completely made up and has no bearing on reality?
No.
Right, so don't use GPT.
But I do need to get just 80% of the way there. I can't, that just 80% would actually be useful.
Yeah. Well, this will definitely be a good reason to talk afterwards to NLP scientists, which I'm not, just to clarify. I'm not someone who's very knowledgeable of this. But yeah, there may be ideas. All right. Do other people have questions? I didn't want to interrupt. Oh, it looks like Daniel Garijo. Did you want to respond?
Yeah, I wanted Deborah to, can you please elaborate a little further into how, when you were creating these community-based standards, how did you manage to push people towards a convergence of terms? Because I've always struggled a lot when creating vocabularies and ontologies to do this.
So the vocabulary itself, that was led by NOAA. It wasn't led by us. So in terms of how we call our variables, and the way they did it is essentially by calling, so they have an extensive database actually, because they were the first one to collect that data. And in the United States are pretty much the only place you can really put your data. And so what they did is hire a librarian to actually go over all the variables and how they were actually represented in the files, and then gone on calls with experts in that field and asking the experts to decide what is the best way to call that variable. So as far as naming, this is how it was done. It was done first by looking at how people were doing it, and then asking a subset of those experts on the best practice. The way we did it, which is basically not necessarily how it should be named, but what should be in the file, is by having, again, a subset of the community working in working groups. And that subset was representing both sides, the people who actually provide the data and what they want to provide and what they think is important, as well as the people using the data. So the people who actually are involved in those global projects, and what they actually need to be able to work on those global computation. So it was a lot of back and forth. And also I would say it's a compromise, and it's one of those things where nobody is really happy about it, but everybody can live with it. And it took us about 6 months to get there, where, you know, it doesn't have to be 100% right, but it has to be good enough.
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to ask if that answered the question.
Yeah.
Great. I'm sorry, I was looking to see if anyone else had their hands raised. It looks like no one else has any questions. But I know you'll probably get some, it looks like Jose Luis.
Yeah, I was just going to ask on the, so you described some of the information extraction from these different types of formats that you have. So there's a lot of expertise at ISI on this type of extraction of information from unstructured and semi-structured data.
Yes.
I assume you've been talking to people. I mean, it's a whole group doing these things. And
so again, I would love anybody to help with this. Like, this was a cry for help at this point. So would love to have more discussions about this.
Yeah, we can discuss follow-up offline, Deborah, because I have a few suggestions with a few new tools that have been developed at the Pedro's group that would be a good fit, at least for extracting some of the templates based CSVs that you have presented.
Yeah, so there is something. We don't have nothing, we have something, and it gets at 40%. And when the file is structured, we're going to call it semi-structure. At least I can grab some of the information. But it's really not, it's wrong more often than it's right.
Okay, Yolanda. Do you have a question, Yolanda?
Sorry, I do, but I have a very bad connection, so I apologize. I hope you can hear me.
I can.
So this was a great talk, Deborah. I think that you have a great vision and a way to understand progress in paleoclimate and paleogeosciences. That is very exciting. And I think you've articulated to us how AI has helped in some of the steps in that process. And my question is, as a non-AI person, as a non-computer scientist, what are the biggest challenges that you have seen in interacting with us So I know, for example, that, you know, the data integration group will talk about data models, and that's not the same thing that you may mean by a data model. And I know that in machine learning, we call things models that you guys don't, you know, recognize as such. So you know, I think there's a lot of culture and terminology and methodology differences. And I wonder, what are the things that you have learned from interacting with AI people for some time now?
I would say it falls under like 3 categories. The first one, which is the one that you describe, is the difference in terminology. And I think that, you know, it's one of the good things about working with paleogeoscientists. We're so used to working interdisciplinary because our field requires it, that we tend to be a little bit more flexible. The second, I would say, is the end goal. And to me, when I work with AI scientists, it's always about the process and making the best system. Whereas for the science community, it's not necessarily what the system is as much as what can the system do for me. And that's kind of like sometimes where there is a little bit of a difference. And the last part is in terms of not just vocabulary, but also knowledge and where kind of we come from and how we think about problems. But that being said, to me, this is kind of a unique opportunity to be able to do things like this, to be able to actually take a field and advance it by using advances in another field. So I would say it's a tremendous opportunity and a lot of fun actually to be working in that.
All right. It looks like there are no more questions, in which case I think perhaps those of you who are meeting with her one-on-one can always talk to Deborah. It looks like that's it. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, Deborah.
Thank you.